Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
So having understood the specificity of the emotions, now let us try to see that how different emotions are experienced by an user among different modalities, right? So let us take the example of this fear emotion. In case of the fear emotion, as you can see in the image itself, that it is characterized by the eyebrows are already raised, right? And they are drawn together, and then eyes are widely open, and then you have lower eyelids, right? If you look at visualize that, and then you have stretched lips. So for example, Paul Ekman and his team, they worked a lot on identifying these different set of facial action units which characterizes a different set of emotions. But these different set of emotions are not only experienced or expressed in one particular modality, that is the facial expression modality, but definitely they are also experienced and expressed in different modalities. And here we will be talking about a bit about how different emotions are experienced or discriminated among the different modalities as well. So for example, if we talk about the fear, fear is also associated with the activation in the frontoparietal brain region. So what do you mean by the frontoparietal brain regions? So basically this is your frontal region, this is your parietal region. So where they meet, that is the place which is known as the frontoparietal brain region. So this is also associated with the higher activity in the frontoparietal brain region, and it is also represented as a higher sympathetic activation. Sympathetic activation, basically it consists of higher cardiovascular activities, which may also include the heart rate variability. So for example, reduced heart rate. So basically heart rate variability, what it means, we will be talking about all those things in when we will be talking about the emotions and the physiological signals. But basically the heart rate variability is basically the variance that we have among the different heart rates, right? So basically what happens that in the case of the fear emotion, we experience it is also expressed by the reduced heart rate variability. Similarly, when you talk about the fear, we can also look at the skin conductance response, and what has been found that in the case of the fear, a higher skin conductance response has been found among the users. And similarly, the facial expressions, when you have this fear emotions, it is also indicated by larger EMG or electromyographic corrugator activity that is in the facial muscles, for example somewhere here, then that is in the anger. So these are the different ways in which the same emotion, that is the fear emotion, can be expressed in the facial expressions, can be expressed in the brain activity, can be expressed, for example, in the cardiovascular activity, can be expressed in the skin conductance responses, and can also be expressed in the EMG activity, right? So you can see that since different emotions are different, they are also experienced or expressed in different modalities in a different way. So similarly, after having understood the fear emotion, let us try to look at the anger emotion. Now if you look at the anger emotion, in the case of the anger emotion, just like we have in the fear emotion, we also have the widely open eyes here, right? And in this case also the eyebrows, if you look at the eyebrows here, so for example the eyebrows are also drawn together, and then the eyelids, for example, they are lowered, and then you have the pressed lips kind of a situation. So this is how the facial expressions characterize the anger emotion. Now of course, not to say that these are the only things that are there, a bit of individual variability can be there, right? So similarly, for example, if you look at the anger emotion and then the brain activity that is corresponding in the with respect to the anger emotion, then what we see that we have more left frontal prefrontal cortex. So basically this is what you have, the prefrontal cortex. So in the prefrontal cortex you have more activity in the case of the anger emotion. And but in this case, for example, a literature is a bit contradictory as well. So Harmon Jones, for example, whereas he has been saying about where he and the other researchers has been saying that the left frontal prefrontal cortex is activated, the literature is a bit contradictory, where it is said that maybe the right prefrontal cortex is more activated, right? Interestingly, when we analyze the heart rate variability, the one that we saw in the case of the fear emotion, we observe no change in the case of the heart rate variability. While if you recall, in the case of the fear emotion, we observed a reduced heart rate variability. So it clearly shows that among the different modalities, different types of discrimination can be possible. So for example, while if you are only looking at the whether the eyes are widely open or not, you may not be able to differentiate between the anger and the fear emotion. But for example, if you are looking at other modalities, such as in this case, if you are looking at the heart rate variability, so while in the case of the anger emotion, we are not going to observe any change in the heart rate variability, but in the case of the fear emotion, we will be observing a reduced heart rate variability, right? So that is how different modalities, they help you to characterize a particular emotion, right? Similarly, for example, in the case of the anger, what happened? Anger can be different types of angers as well, right? So it can be an anger where you are just someone is angry in front of you and you are responding with an angerness, or for example, you are it can also the response that you get in the fear response, you may also have similar kind of responses in the anger. For example, as we just saw in the case of the facial emotions, right? Facial expressions. So, but nevertheless, we have already seen the psychophysiological responses will always be different in both the cases. And that is what is going to help you to discriminate among these two different emotions. Perfect. So with that, now let us look at the similar type of analysis of the disgust and the other emotions. So this is a very simple picture of the disgust emotion. Now if you look at the disgust emotion, what we have for example, this is broadly characterized by the wrinkled nose bridge here and raised cheeks here, right? For example, you have this kind of emotion, and then you have raised upper lip. So for example, upper lip is a bit raised. Of course, again, not to mention that all these behaviors that have been characterized by Paul Ekman and his team, there is a good amount of individual variability, and depending from one individual to another, this particular behavior may change a bit here and there. But largely, this is how the disgust emotion, for example, could be perceived in the facial expressions, right? Now, if you look at the skin conductance responses, it depends on what type of stimuli is causing the disgust emotion. That is very interesting here. So, for example, what is happening that if you have a core disgust inducing stimuli, right? So, you may have different types of skin conductance response, or in comparison to, for example, if you have body boundary violating stimuli where you may be looking at some mutilation scenes, then the skin conductance responses could be different. So for example, in the case of the core disgust inducing stimuli, which is such as the pictures of dirty toilets, for example, you have either unchanged or you have decreased kind of skin conductance response. On the other hand, if you look at this mutilation scenes kind of stimuli, then what you will have increased skin conductance response. So this is also very interesting thing to observe and very important to note as well, that it may also happen that depending upon the stimuli, your response may also change even if it belongs to the same emotional category, right? So this is where you have to be a bit careful again. Perfect. So now having looked at the disgust, now let us look at the sadness emotion. Now in the case of the sadness emotion, as you can see here, this is broadly characterized by the lowered lip corners, for example, and then the raised inner eyebrows, right? I hope that you can look into the image here broadly. And then if you look at the cardiovascular activity, it is associated with the increased blood flow, right? And then at the same time, there are two different types of sadness where we would like to differentiate the physiological responses. One is the crying related sadness. So in the crying related sadness, where you are literally crying when you are sad, then increased heart rate is observed, while we do not observe any change in the heart rate variability. Please pay attention that heart rate and heart rate variability, these two are different things, right? So increased heart rate, but maybe no change in the heart rate variability. And then you also have the increased skin conductance. Now, In the case of the non-crying sadness, when you are sad but you are not crying, please pay attention that where earlier you were observing an increased heart rate, now you are observing a reduction in the heart rate. Earlier, when you were not observing any change in the heart rate variability, now you are also observing a reduced heart rate variability. Similarly, where earlier you were observing an increased skin conductance, now you are observing a reduced skin conductance, and similarly your respiration also it is increased, right? So then there is a difference in the sadness also when whether the individual is crying or whether the individual is not crying. Now, why these different types of changes are important? These different types of changes are important because now imagine that if you want to understand a particular emotional response, then you will have to understand these different types of behaviors in order to know that what exactly is the modality to look for, number one. Number two, what exactly is the type of change that you can expect in that particular type of modality, right? So that is why it is important for us to understand that how different emotions are being characterized or expressed in different modalities. So let us take the last example, which is of the happiness. Now, in the case of the happiness, as hypothesized, as given by Paul Ekman and his team, for example, you have raised cheeks, you have raised lip corners, and you have tensed lower eyelids, right? So this is broad characterization in terms of the facial expressions. Now, other thing that you need to look at that in a very interesting study, Abel and Kruger found that the intensity of the smiling of an individual in the photographs has also been found to predict longevity, right? So for example, what they showed in their this interesting study, that individuals with no smile, their age has been found to be ranged from 72.9 years. Similarly, the individuals, those who showed partial smiles in the photographs, their longevity ranged around 75 years. Similarly, those who had the Gaussian smiles, like very broad smiles, their longevity has been found to be around 80 years. Right? So this was another very interesting study that Abel and Kruger performed. Now, happiness, of course, like the other emotions, happiness can also be associated with the activation in the other physiological signals as well. So, for example, it is associated with the medial prefrontal and the temporal parietal cortices, right? And that is the more brain activity in these regions. And then at the same time, there are lots of literature which also highlights the role of the left prefrontal cortex in the positive effects. So what it says that in the case of the positive emotions such as happiness, there is an increased activity in the left prefrontal cortex, that is this side of the brain region, right? And if you look at the other physiological signals, then happiness is also associated with the decreased heart rate variability, and at the same time amusement with the decreased heart rate variability, such as the case is the amusement and the joy are associated with the increased heart rate variability, right? So basically the differentiation between the happiness and the amusement and the joy is that there is varying degree of positivity as well as the intensity there. And by this experiment this experiment by Kriebig, what they showed that while there is a decreased heart rate variability in the happiness, there is an increased heart rate variability in the case of the amusement and the joy among the users, right? Perfect. So now we talked about one very interesting point here, that in the case of the positive affects, more activity is found in the left prefrontal cortex. And building upon that, we will be talking about one very interesting concept in the psychology of the emotion, that is the emotion and the brain asymmetry. So basically what happens in this case, that it has been found by the researchers that higher activation in the left region of the brain is found in relative to the right region of the brain when the individual is experiencing any positive feeling or experiencing higher engagement. And this has been, of course, given by Kwan and several other researchers, the same thing. So what it means, so for example, if you are experiencing a positive feeling, if you are experiencing approach motivation, more dominant motivation, then you will have more brain activity in the left side of the hemisphere. But versus when you are experiencing, let's say, some negative feeling, such as, let's say, you are experiencing sadness, fear and all those kind of things, or you are feeling less dominant when you are having a withdrawal motivation, then more increased right frontal activity can be observed in the brain. So that is what is the relation between the emotions and the brain asymmetry. But there is one exception to this thing, which is the in case of the anger. In the case of the anger, that we, as we have seen before also, that in case of the anger, even though anger is broadly characterized as a negative feeling, but more activity is found in the left frontal cortex of the brain. So this is where there is a single exception. Otherwise, the science is very clear here that if you are experiencing a positive emotion, you will have more brain activity in the left side of the hemisphere. If you are experiencing a negative emotion, you will have more activity in the right side of the hemisphere. And this simple test can be done to understand that which side of the brain is activated, and accordingly what could be the type of the emotion that, for example, an individual may be feeling or not, right? So with that, we today we finish at the emotion and the brain asymmetry, and in the next session we will be talking about the emotional design, right? So let us look forward to the next